hope that you are thinking about Deuteronomy. An extraordinarily influential book, can we say that? Like every book in the Bible is important, but Deuteronomy really is important. It's influenced other Old Testament books, for example, and these are just some examples: Hosea, Jeremiah, Malachi. If you read those books, you'll kind of be hearing echoes of Deuteronomy. So it's influenced other Old Testament books, and of course, it's awfully important for Jesus too. Remember, for example, and this is just an example, the 3 times Jesus quotes the Bible when he's being tempted in the wilderness. Remember, each of those 3 quotations are from Deuteronomy. So just a few little examples, almost at random. But yeah, an incredibly important Old Testament book to kind of get your head around. And Dave, you've either been preaching or you're about to preach on Deuteronomy. I'm not sure which one.
Last one is this Sunday.
Excellent. There you go. Well, don't let me spoil the series. And you can have the last say. That's right. So you can spend all tomorrow morning contradicting everything I say, which is good. Righto. So Deuteronomy. Just notice Deuteronomy basically takes the form of sermons. It's the preaching of Moses. And why do you preach? Because you're wanting to persuade people about stuff. Yeah, it's teaching, but preaching, of course, is more than that. It's got an important teaching component, yes, but it's also kind of persuading, trying to move people, trying to affect people. So Deuteronomy has that flavor. And I tell my students at college, if you want to learn how to preach, look at Moses in Deuteronomy, look at the prophets, and of course, Jesus. You know, that's the 3 great Bible examples of preaching. In terms of some of the important themes of Deuteronomy, Moses himself is awfully prominent because the book basically takes the form of the speeches or sermons of Moses. And in Deuteronomy, Moses becomes a model for all the later prophets. So, for example, in Deuteronomy 18, which is a very important passage from verse 15, Deuteronomy 18 from verse 15, God promises that he's going to raise up prophets like Moses, like you, talking to Moses. So all the prophets are kind of little Moses figures, though they don't come up to Moses' stature. At the end of the book in chapter 34, it says, 34 verse 10, there has not arisen a prophet in Israel like Moses. So the prophets are like Moses, but don't quite measure up to his greatness. And of course, these are also verses that are picked up in the New Testament for Jesus. One of the ways in which the New Testament talks about Jesus, of course, he's the divine Son of God. Yes, he's the Messiah. But another category or another way of explaining Jesus, he is the prophet like Moses. He's the ultimate fulfillment of this Moses prophet figure who is going to be sent. You know, the ultimate revelation of God is Jesus, the prophet like Moses. So in other words, Deuteronomy has gone into how the New Testament explains Jesus. So again, another sign of how important it is. Now remember, this preaching of Moses is happening right on the border of the Promised Land. They're just the other side of the Jordan River from Jericho. And so there's lots of things about land in the book of Deuteronomy. But maybe just one interesting feature is the way in which Moses in Deuteronomy continually describes, Palestine, that they're going to go in and enter and conquer and possess. He repeatedly describes it as the good land, using that adjective, the good land. Let me just give you a couple of examples. Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 25. It is a good land which the Lord our God gives us. It's a good land. And these kind of expressions occur again and again. And the description of the land in chapter 8, where we've got Moses sounding like a real estate agent. This is the most wonderful piece of real estate ever. You know, Moses, the real estate agent. In chapter 8, verse 10, you shall eat and be full, and you shall bless the Lord your God for the good land which he has given you. Now, why are we describing the promised land as the good land? Well, it's because it's like the Garden of Eden, you see. It's watered, it's fruitful. They're going to live the good life in this land. And there's quite a bit of emphasis on eating and stuff like that in the book of Deuteronomy again, because they're eating all the good products of the land. So the good land, what I would do with this, of course, is that, and this is something of a theme all through the Bible, God's goodness. You know, he's provided us with a world which is good for human habitation. Everything God asks us to do is not only right, it's not only the right thing to do, you know, like we might think morally, or it's not only the truthful thing, but it's also the good thing. In other words, it's what will be beneficial to us. So God's commands and the life he would have us live, not only the right thing to do, but what we were created to do and what is good for us. So the good theme is a very, very important one, I suggest, in the book of Deuteronomy. And I think we can do a lot with that. Maybe we can talk about that later, because not everybody thinks that, you know, the Bible and the Christian faith is good for you. There's prominent people around saying the world would be a better place without Christianity. Well, the Bible takes the opposite approach. It's good. God is the ultimate benefactor, you see. He's asking us to do these things because he wants us to enjoy the good life. So this is something picked up in Deuteronomy. Another theme I'd emphasize in Deuteronomy is the important passage about the king. And we can just look at that for a moment. And so we're looking in chapter 17 from verse 14, a passage where it's anticipated that Israel is going to have a king. That eventually happens, doesn't it, with Saul and David and so forth, but the king. Now, when we look at what Deuteronomy says about the king, we see that the pattern or the kind of king that's anticipated is not your typical king. It's not about wealth. It's not about power. And the role of the king is carefully contained because the ideal in Deuteronomy is that Israel is a brotherhood. We're all brothers. And so no one should get too high above his brothers. And so the king, it's not about power. It's not about that kind of stuff. But the king is described here as a model Israelite, setting an example for all the Israelites. So in chapter 17, verse 18, I quote, "And when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law, and he shall read in it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, keeping all his words." See, the king here, what's his main job is to read his Bible and to obey it, you know, setting an example for all the Israelites. And so it's not about power, but it's about the king modeling how all the Israelites should be living. So this is a very interesting kind of presentation. And we know in the New Testament, you know, how Paul in his letters often addresses them as brothers, you know, brothers and sisters. Well, that's language which goes back to Deuteronomy and also Leviticus for that matter. The idea of the Israelites being brothers of each other. So this lovely way of talking about the Christian community. It's a brotherhood, a sisterhood. You know, it's not about power. It's not about hierarchy. It's not about people bossing each other around. You know, it's a brotherhood. It's a family. And that ethos goes back here to Deuteronomy, and it actually affects how the king is presented. Yeah, as I said, not about power. In lots of ways, the king in Deuteronomy, the king that's anticipated, it's a House of Windsor style kingship. It's like a constitutional monarchy. Again, it's not about power. It's about setting an example. The king's the first among equals. We could use that kind of expression too. So I think we have here in Deuteronomy then a very attractive model, both for the church and for society, you see, where it's about serving each other, treating each other as brothers and sisters, looking after each other. So that kind of equality, or another bigger word, egalitarianism, that kind of ethos in Deuteronomy then goes on to affect how the New Testament views the church. Paul in his letters, writing to Christian brothers, all the time encouraging them to care for each other and, treat each other properly type stuff. All that goes back to Deuteronomy. Like in many ways, so much of the Bible does link back to what we find here. Now, you're taking the odd note because I'm hoping you'll kind of have some responses to this. I'm not above contradiction. So you can contradict me with impunity because I'm in Melbourne, I can't get you. So, we'll have a bit of discussion about these things. Now, of course, ethics, lifestyle. Deuteronomy has lots of things in this area. And remember how in Deuteronomy we have the 10 Commandments, as we call it, given in Deuteronomy chapter 5. Remember, these 10 commandments are given in Exodus 20, but now they're repeated again in Deuteronomy chapter 5. Now, what people don't always realize is that in chapters 12 through to 26 in Deuteronomy, what Moses is doing is that he goes through these 10 commandments in order again and gives examples of how to put them into action. So from chapter 12 to 26. So if we're going to have, like if we're having a sermon series on church or a Bible study on the 10 Commandments, a good thing to do is, well, how does Moses begin to explain and apply the 10 Commandments? And that's what he is actually doing in all the instructions of chapters 12 to 26 in Deuteronomy. Now, what I want us to notice is, yes, I know we call them the 10 Commandments, but the Bible never does. And it doesn't do that for a reason. The actual Bible expression is the 10 words, or the 10 sayings, we could say that, the 10 words, not the 10 Commandments. Like, it's not wrong to call them the 10 Commandments, but that could give a wrong impression, because what we have in these 10 words, they are 10 moral principles. It's better to view them not so much as commandments, though there's stuff to do. I'm not denying that, of course, but they're 10 great moral principles. What I mean by this is they're principles that they then have lots and lots of application, wide application to lots of areas of life. They're the 10 great moral principles that can be applied in lots of different ways in daily life and society. And that's what Moses begins to do in chapters 12 and following. So let me just look at a few examples of what he does with these 10 words, or the 10 commandments. Now, remember how the first one, looking at chapter 5, verse 7, make no other gods. And then verse 8, you mustn't make a graven image, and so forth. In other words, idolatry is wrong. Now, why is idolatry wrong? Well, it could be wrong for lots of reasons, right? Having idols. But the Deuteronomy answer or explanation is maybe just a slightly different from what you may expect. Really goes back to chapter 4, in Deuteronomy chapter 4, where God reminds his people of what happened at Mount Sinai. And he says, you saw no form, you only saw a voice. What's wrong with idols? What's wrong with having a physical depiction of God or attempting that? What's wrong with that? Well, they didn't see God, they heard him. In other words, the real connection between God and us, our link with God is through the word, not through an image. That's what's wrong with idols. It takes the focus off the word, the verbal message that God has used to communicate who he is and what he wants us to do. So yes, so Deuteronomy talks about idolatry and why it is wrong. In other words, we can say in our terms, it takes the focus off the Bible. We don't need images. We need to listen to what God has said, read what God has said. Our link with God, the message comes not in visual form, but through words, spoken and written communication. Now, let me give you an example too of the wide-ranging application of these principles. So the fourth commandment, as we call it, or the fourth word, remember, is about the Sabbath. Observe the Sabbath day. Well, when Moses begins to expound and explain and apply this, and he's doing it that in chapter 15 and 16, what we notice is that the Sabbath, it's not just about the seventh day. But this Sabbath principle goes on and is explained in terms of all the festivals in Israel, Passover, Feast of Weeks, Tabernacles. In other words, the whole worship system of Israel is an outworking and application of the Sabbath commandment. And also things like Jubilee, the year of release, and so forth. In other words, this fourth commandment is a wide-ranging principle that actually shapes a person's whole year and even whole life. It's a global moral principle, in other words, this pattern of work and rest. So yeah, that's not always taken into account. Sometimes people, when they're kind of talking or even arguing, oh, the Sabbath or Sunday, what do we do with that? Often they're only thinking in a very narrow terms about, what do you do on a Sunday or something? Now, that might be part of it, but this fourth commandment or word, this work rest principle, is meant to affect and shape the whole of our lives and all of society. Another example, the fifth word about honor your father and mother. And Moses in Deuteronomy in chapters 17 and 18, what he does here, when honor your father and mother, again, it's broadened. So we're talking about authority figures generally, not just mum and dad, but priests and judges and prophets and kings. In other words, this word about honoring father and mother is broadened to all authority figures, you see. We're not just thinking of the family circle. And the other thing to notice here is, because is this really a commandment for children? Question mark. Are we really saying there's 9 commandments for adults and 1 commandment for children? That's not very likely. No, this is actually a commandment for adults. In other words, if we're applying it to mother and father, this is encouraging adults to look after their aged parents, to honor their and look after their aged parents. Remember, Jesus actually applies it in that way in the Gospels. And now, of course, it applies secondarily to children, and Paul does that in Ephesians chapter 6. But like the rest of the 10 Commandments, it first of all has adults in mind. And again, that's something we need to think about. Also, just one other comment. For example, the commandment about do not steal. What is that talking about? Do not steal. first and foremost, it's saying, and see, why do we have something about stealing in a list of instructions about really serious stuff, like adultery and murder and stuff like that, stealing? Because what we're first of all thinking about is stealing people, kidnapping. For example, in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 7, if a man is found stealing one of his brethren, the people of Israel, and if he treats him as a slave and sells him, then the thief shall die. Yeah. The first application of do not steal is about kidnapping, slave trade, that kind of stuff. It's talking about serious things. But of course, it is also widened, do not kill. In other words, we should be looking after the welfare of people. And so health and safety would be applications of this. Sorry, that's do not kill. But stealing people, of course, it can apply to property. But first of all, Deuteronomy here is concerned about not stealing people, but also not stealing things from vulnerable people, which could cause their death or harm. So again, Moses is applying these 10 great principles in some interesting ways. So that's just some food for thought there. So what I'm saying is that when Moses picks up these 10 commandments, he treats them as 10 great wide-ranging moral principles that have lots of applications. Now, he's only giving some examples. His exposition is not exhaustive. And the application for us is to think of, well, we also need to be thinking about how we apply these principles in our life, church life, and even in society. Just one more thing about all the instructions in Deuteronomy. Of course, it's not salvation by works. But what we have in Deuteronomy, this is how saved people live, like in the New Testament. Why are we obeying Jesus? Why are we serving Jesus? Not because we think we need to do that to go to heaven. No, because he has saved us. He's rescued us. We're grateful for that. We want to express our gratitude. In other words, both in the New Testament, also in Deuteronomy, this is how saved people live, you see. So it's got that gospel. In other words, all the instructions in Deuteronomy have this gospel foundation. And if we're thinking in Deuteronomy 2, there's a big emphasis on the heart. The law needs to be written on the heart. Let me give you just one example, but it's something of a theme that runs through the book. In other words, in Deuteronomy, it's got lots of instructions, but we're not thinking about legalism. We're not just thinking about outward performance, but it's also about attitude and motivation, the law on the heart. So chapter 8, verse 2, you shall remember all the way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness, that he might humble you, testing you to know what is in your heart, whether you would keep these commandments or not. The heart attitudes, and God, the law or God's instructions have to find a home in that deep inner place in our lives, so that what we do is expressing what we are. And our outward performance is just the outward signs of what's happening on the inside, the law on the heart. So again, we don't need to wait to the New Testament to discover that, obedience is more than just outward performance. Deuteronomy is saying that. And in fact, one of the ways in which Deuteronomy sums up obedience is it's loving God. The famous verse in chapter 6, verse 4, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength." See, Jesus didn't invent that saying. He's getting it from Deuteronomy. Loving God with heart, soul, mind, and strength. It's all about a loving response of gratitude to God because of what he has done in saving and rescuing us. Now, remember this connection between love and obedience. It's in John's Gospel. It's in the first letter of John particularly. Where is the Apostle John getting this from? This kind of link up between love and obedience as an expression of love. He's getting it from Deuteronomy. That's another way. It's another example of this wide and important influence of Deuteronomy in the New Testament generally. In other words, well, I suppose what I'm saying is there's something very attractive about what Moses says in his preaching. Yeah, there's lots of instructions, but he doesn't forget to emphasize it's all meant to come from our heart, a changed heart. It's all about attitude. And also, God is claiming the whole of life for himself. And so the 10 Commandments, or these 10 great principles, they're meant to shape our whole life experience, our whole life response to God. Now, again, I think that is very attractive. Now, it would be very wrong for me too not to emphasize that Deuteronomy has a big emphasis on caring for vulnerable people. Let me give you an example in chapter 12, verse 12, and this is almost at random because Moses is all the time saying these kind of things. And you shall rejoice before the Lord your God, you, your sons and your daughters, your manservants, your maidservants, the Levite who is within your towns, and so forth. These vulnerable groups, the servants, the Levite, also often the widows, the orphans. In other words, there's a very strong social justice, social care theme running through the book of Deuteronomy. In other words, the moral imperative to be caring for people who need help and assistance in their lives. Now, of course, that's what we see in the ministry of Jesus, don't we? You know, he was a friend to the poor. In his ministry, yes, he's teaching, but he's also healing and helping. Now, that whole ethic of care and social justice goes back to the book of Deuteronomy. That's where Jesus is partly allowing the book of Deuteronomy to shape the kind of ministry that he has. Now, one thing that means for us as Christian people today and in our churches is that yes, we want to be churches which are teaching and proclaiming the Bible, God's word. You know, we're proclaiming the gospel, but with that, the other arm of church life needs to be, you know, the social care aspect. In other words, we're not just proclaiming God's love, we're showing it. Now, that kind of pattern, I'm saying, goes back to the book of Deuteronomy here. So the strong social justice theme that's running through our passage. Another example in chapter 16, verse 11, where he's giving instructions about some of the different festivals. This is the Feast of Weeks. And you shall rejoice before the Lord your God, you, your son, your daughter, your manservant, your maidservant, the Levite, who is within your towns, the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow among you. In other words, when they all get together for their festivals and they have all this eating and rejoicing, make sure it's not just some people who can join in, but make sure all these vulnerable people, you know, the foreigner, the widow, the orphan, the Levite, make sure all these people have food to eat and can enter into the celebrations. In other words, this kind of inclusive, making sure everyone can enjoy the bounty of the land. So again, this is a very attractive ethic, and part of the application I'm suggesting is, yes, in our church life, we're spreading the gospel, but we're also showing we've got ministries of care in the community. Those two kind of aspects that one does not have to take away from the other, but both are essential, and both really go back to this book of Deuteronomy. Let me just say a couple of other things. Now, obviously, the book of Deuteronomy is very much focused on Israel and the Israelites, but foreign people are not forgotten. Now, we see this already when I mentioned the alien. Remember, the alien is not someone from Mars, that kind of expression. The alien, it's the foreigner who lives among the Israelites. So there's various times in the book of Deuteronomy where we're reminded of other people groups. It's not always negative about foreigners. Of course, in Deuteronomy, we have the issue of the Canaanites, and the Canaanites will have to be dealt with. But also there's positive passages about other people groups. And Israel is meant to be an example to other people groups. Chapter 4 from verse 5, behold, I've taught you statutes and ordinances as the Lord my God commands me, that you should do them in the land that you're entering. Keep them and do them. This will be your wisdom and understanding in the sight of the peoples. Notice that? In other words, if they obey these commandments, they'll show themselves to be wise, and other people groups are going to be watching and learning from what they see the Israelites doing. So Deuteronomy focused on Israel, of course, but Israel was meant to be a model nation that other people groups could look at, learn from, and see a better way. Now, that's part of church life too, isn't it? It's a scary thought, isn't it? But here in Deuteronomy, but also elsewhere, the wider world should be able to look at the church, what's happening in church, how Christians are behaving, and see an example that's worth following. Now, we all know that sometimes it's not exactly like that, right? Fair enough. But that's what should be. We're meant to be this exemplary community, those who believe the right things and are doing the right things. We're meant to be this exemplary community that the world can look at, learn from, and be influenced by. Well, that idea, again, goes back to the book of Deuteronomy here. So summing it all up, I'm saying Deuteronomy is an incredibly influential book, both on other parts of the Old Testament, but I've given some examples of how it might be part of the explanation of what we see Jesus doing, what we see the Apostle Paul and Apostle John teaching in their letters, for example. The whole brotherhood idea, which is then picked up in the New Testament. Of course, the church, we're a brotherhood, we're a sisterhood. We're meant to be treating each other as brothers and sisters. The social care ethic of Deuteronomy, which is meant to be reflected in our lives and church life as well. The 10 Commandments, which are really 10 principles, which each of them should affect our whole lives, you see. That's how Moses is explaining the 10 Commandments. Each one of these is a principle that should spread out into all our lives, all the different aspects of what we're doing, and influence what we're doing. 10 great moral principles. And we've seen more than one way in which Deuteronomy anticipates Jesus, who's the final great prophet like Moses, you see, the final great teacher. Remember in Luke's gospel, where Luke's version of the Sermon on the Mount is the Sermon on the Plain. It's the Sermon on the Plain because he's thinking of this, Deuteronomy, Moses' Sermon on the Plain, on the other side of the Jordan River, you see. In other words, Luke, in his version of the Sermon on the Mount, is describing Jesus as like the ultimate Moses, who is instructing and preaching to God's people. So this book of Deuteronomy, very influential. Dave, I'm proud of you that you've done a series on Deuteronomy. This is a really important book at different times in church life for God's people to be taken, take God's people to this book of Deuteronomy, explain it, look at it together. It's an incredibly important book. Well, I've given you enough to think about. There are a few thoughts on this book of Deuteronomy. I'm hoping you've got some comments or questions. Dave, hand over to you.
Okay, yeah. So I think if people have some questions related to this or some other questions.
Absolutely.
Sections, yeah. We've got the mic here, but those who are on Zoom, just unmute and you can ask your question or whatever. Yep.
Or remind me of something I didn't say. Feel free.
Well, there was a verse you didn't mention. No.
Exactly.
Just one.
Hi, thanks so much for that, Greg. That was great.
Yeah.
This is Di.
Right. Yeah.
I'm just really interested what you're saying about Sabbath. That was really so interesting to hear that it's not just a Sunday, but it was really meant to influence their whole lives. And I haven't actually heard that before, and I'm just wondering if you'd mind just talking about that a little bit more.
I can say that. Yeah, it's this pattern of work and rest.
Yeah.
So in other words, this whole Sabbath principle, it can go into, well, we work for 40 years and then we retire. So retirement could be, that kind of thing. Annual holidays. See, some of the things that we've built into our society for workers, you know what I mean? People are allowed to have weeks off from work. There's long service leave. There's this kind of stuff. Now, I know our legislators weren't thinking of Deuteronomy or the Sabbath, but all these things could be seen as legitimate applications of the Sabbath, so it can have societal wide implications. You know what I mean? Like, do we allow people to have a kind of an appropriate pattern of work and rest in their lives? The minister's day off, but also in other areas. Are we working in a restful way, and are we resting in a useful way? In other words, this pattern of work and rest, we're supposed to work in a relaxed kind of way. Remember, we work in a way showing we trust in God, not in our own abilities. We work in a restful way, and also we rest in a useful way. In other words, Christian people, when we retire, for example, we're not just thinking, oh, great, now I can just indulge myself with endless overseas trips and don't think about anything else. Like, the Sabbath might be encouraging us, this Sabbath principle, our rest should be useful, just like our work could be restful. So Di, these are a couple of examples, because really what I'm saying is, we're all still working out how to apply this great principle, because it has a multitude of possible implications, you see. So that's right. And that's what Moses is doing when you see what he does with the Sabbath. He's talking about one day in seven, but he's also talking about the festivals, which kind of punctuate the year. Passover, even though it might be a time for doing agricultural work, sorry, you've got to stop. And we've got to have Passover, for example. So this kind of interruption of work and this kind of pattern, so it's a wide-ranging principle, Di. And it's not just me saying it, it's what Moses is saying. Di, do you have any thoughts on that yourself, on possible applications?
No, I'll have to keep thinking about it. It's just, I have been thinking about Sabbath because, it's something that just pops up every now and again. And think, how do you apply this seventh this commandment? Because it seems like all the others it's fairly, I suppose the Sabbath one, we almost feel like it's a little bit outdated now in our day and age, where we
That's right.
And did Jesus sort of say, Sabbath wasn't made for man, but man for the Sabbath? So does that, what freedom does that give us in how we apply it?
No doubt a lot of freedom, but that's part of the problem as Christian people. Often we're just thinking about this too narrowly. And Moses is telling us, think about it really widely. And as I said, it should feed into, how our whole idea of work life, holidays, long service leave, sick leave, superannuation. I'm wanting to apply this whole work rest principle to a whole lot of stuff in our own lives, but also in how we structure our society in ways which are good for human beings, you see. We're not working people to death. On the other hand, we're not just being totally self-indulgent. Like, I'd be seeking to think of Sabbath principles. How does it shape all those kind of areas? Yeah.
No, it's food for thought. Thanks very much, Greg.
Good. That's right.
So on ABC News last night, I think it was, they're talking about lengthening the paternity leave, I think it was. So that would be another outworking. So it's a way of caring for families and affirming the importance of bringing up babies and looking after the wife as well as the husband and all that kind of thing.
I agree, George. There's seasons of life, you see. And yes, the mother getting maternity leave, the father getting paternity leave, it's breaks from work which kind of sustain the good and contribute to the good life, you see. Yes, so I could well see those things as legitimate outworkings of this Sabbath principle. Yes, indeed. We're not to think of it too narrowly. Yeah, it's certainly not old-fashioned fuddy-duddy and no longer applies if we're really seeking to apply it to stuff like that. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah, I like that, your expression about making rest useful.
Yes.
Or considering how we can make rest useful. And because some people think, oh, it's my day off. Okay, I'm going to play computer games all day, or I'm going to veg in front of the whole season.
Game of Thrones or something.
6 seasons of.
That's right.
In itself may be allowable, but if that's all we do for our rest, then that's not going to be very nurturing, life-giving rest. We need to incorporate, things where we can relax, but also ways that will nourish our relationship with God and with our family. And maybe, it might include naps or exercise or going to an art gallery, just really being more proactive. Because in the past, I think Sabbath has been, you're not allowed to do this, you're not allowed to do that. And, definitely for Jews, even modern Jews, they're not, well, some of them feel like they're not allowed to turn on a light switch on Sabbath because that's work. But I like to think, and I read a book by Pete Scazzero on emotionally healthy living.
Good.
Where said, he calls it, his chapter on Sabbath is Sabbath delight. So more thinking of this as a wonderful gift from God. Hey, we can stop work. We don't have to feel guilty for being lazy. We need to stop and do some other activities that will build us up, refresh us, rest us. And I've found his thoughts good, and it will be different for each person. Some might
absolutely
love to go for a walk by the river, some might want to go to an art gallery, some might want to go out and a lovely meal that someone else has cooked, or invite people over. So many, we are free. The Bible doesn't say these are the 567 things you're allowed to do or not allowed to do on Sabbath. He just says keep the Sabbath or else.
No, I agree absolutely, Georgie. Yeah. And the other aspect is to work restfully.
Yes.
I'm a great believer. I keep busy, but I don't like appearing to be busy. Oh,
Yeah.
Dave, yeah, of course I've got time to do this thing on Deuteronomy. You know what I mean? Kind of, we need to work restfully, not kind of work in a stressful kind of way. And so I think there's a whole lot of applications in that kind of area. Yeah, letting rest come into work and letting work come into rest. See, again, it's all kind of messy. Oh, it's quite individual. Oh, we're all still working it out. But that's what these 10 commandments are about. They're kind of asking us, challenging us to explore all this kind of stuff creatively in a wide-ranging way, you see. Yep. Well, that's what Moses is telling us to do in Deuteronomy. It hasn't always been recognized. Yeah.
And on that, Robin here, I was just thinking on that same point, I've heard it also talked about that in each day, you can think about that as well, of having that restful time. So not even in a weekly or
I agree.
way, it could be in a day, that we take that time and which is partly that we would be wanting to, that we would read God's word, but also just having that little refreshment for our soul or for something, and we know when we don't, you go from one thing to another.
Yeah.
How that affects us if we do that day after day,
No, Robin, I think that's great, because one of my applications of the fourth commandment is to have a grandpa nap.
Right, lunch. Yes. Yeah.
Why can't that be part of the application? Have a grandpa nap, as you're saying. Yeah, let's get this pattern of work and rest even down to a day. Exactly.
Yes.
I love that. It's not just 1 day and 7. Maybe it's how we structure a day, but maybe it's how we structure our whole lifetime in terms of our working life, retirement. And also, I'm a great believer, if you can't be lazy when you're a kid, when can you be? Like, let's stop pressurizing our kids.
Children, I know.
Let them be lazy and waste time, because that's a stage of life where they're allowed to do that. So I think the Sabbath could be part of this. Parents, stop stressing your kids. You know what I mean? Let them just grow up gradually. So I think all these things could be applications of the Sabbath commandment.
Yeah, I worked at one of those tutoring colleges.
Oh yeah.
For a couple of years, just part-time, and I just couldn't do it anymore, because the amount of, right from kindergarten, the amount of pressure on these children, that they were doing all this extra work, and all I could think of is, when are you going to play?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So allowing children to play, can't that be part of the outworking of so we need to be careful how we're structuring our society.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
No, good thought, Robert.
And we adults can learn to play again and not think it's lazy or a waste of time. Or we need that fun. We need that wasting time that's not really wasting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No, exactly.
I was just thinking when you were saying working restfully, and I was thinking, I'm beginning in my thinking to think rest and trust.
It's part, it's
sort of so closely linked.
They are.
Really. So working trustfully is working restfully. It's just...
Well, that's where Christians should be able to rest better than others, because we know there's a God watching over us. You know what I mean? It's not just what we do. You know what I mean? It's what God does through us. So, we as Christians should be setting an example of how to rest. Yes, because it's an expression of faith. That's what you're saying, Diane. I agree. Yes.
Could we just leave that particular topic for a minute? I realise but no, it's great.
It's good.
We've actually got a bit more time. We can talk after this.
Yep.
But I'm just wondering if there were questions on other aspects that people might have, because I know
we've just about used our time up. It's time for morning tea. Exactly.
That's right.
And morning tea break is part of the application of the Sabbath.
Yeah, that's right. Arthur.
Just one quick question, and if it's on the wrong topic, that's okay. I was just wondering if the Jews, what happened that the Pharisees and that then had that cry about how to rest on the Sabbath, and Jesus pulls them up. But if that's on the wrong track or we don't have time, that's okay.
No, that's on the track after. Yeah, see, sometimes we just forget that the Pharisees didn't understand the Old Testament. Remember how Jesus said they know neither the scriptures nor the power of God. Don't get the impression, even though the Pharisees supposedly, love the law and all this stuff, doesn't mean they understood it. So Jesus is our guide, isn't it, as a proper interpretation of the law. And so Moses is certainly not encouraging any of the kind of things that the Pharisees were on about. They totally misunderstood what Moses was saying. Yeah. And so when the Pharisees are kind of annoyed by Jesus, we're not to think for a moment, that Jesus is kind of ignoring the Old Testament. No, Jesus is all the time showing a proper understanding and application of the Old Testament,
Yeah. And I think just on that and the Pharisees, there was that huge gap between the end of Malachi, that 400-year period where there was no prophetic voice in the land.
That's right.
And I think over that time, what became the Pharisees and how they solidified what they understood or didn't understand about from the Old Testament happened in that as part of that period and part of that
indeed.
historical progression. Yeah.
Yep. Well, you've done well. My comments were just to kind of spur your thinking, and I'm glad I've done that. And you continue. Have a really good morning.